Hey folks, welcome back to class and happy Wednesday. This is our last official day of lecture, which is pretty wild. So I want to thank you all first off for the hard work that you've put in. I've really fundamentally enjoyed all of your performances so far and the conversations that we've had, workshopping your performances and building them into what they are. I think that everybody has made a lot of progress over the course of the semester. I'm really happy with the results of what you've been doing. And I'm really excited to see how these develop into your final performance projects, which again will be due on Tuesday of next week, which is our final exam class period. So tomorrow then is a workshop day. So if you have not contacted me to make an appointment to meet yet, please do so as soon as you can. Also, I just wanted to remind you that your fourth/fifth, so your last forums post is due tomorrow. Also on the schedule, it says that your peer reviews for the multi-text performances for your peers are due tomorrow, but I know that we had an extra day for that, so maybe you haven't had time to watch all of your peers' performances yet. As long as you get those to your peers by Monday, I think that that'll be fine, and I'll update that in the syllabus and put that in an email as well. Then the last logistical thing that I just wanted to discuss really quick is that it also says that you have final exam review questions. Those are due tomorrow. Those are optional. You don't need to post a final exam review question if you don't want to. I'm just looking at these as sort of your last FAQs. So if you have any questions after today's lecture or over the last 2 weeks of material that you think is going to be important for your final writing assignment, please write a final exam review question and I will be happy to answer it. I'll either answer it in writing or I'll post another video depending on how many I get. But again, because the final exam is a written essay rather than a exam, I don't think that there's a real need for you to ask review questions unless you have them or you feel uncomfortable with some part of the material that you're really going to be working with. Excuse me. And I will, of course, before your final also go through and answer all of the FAQ questions that you've posted so far that I haven't responded to so that you feel like you have a good grasp of the material before you write your final exam. But in any case, that is sort of the idea behind the final exam review questions. And again, they are optional. You do not have to post one unless if you don't want to, and just email me also if you have additional questions. That would also be fine, and we can always set up an appointment to talk before your final exam as well if you have questions beyond what we cover in your workshop. So I think that takes care of the logistical things for the most part. I will have your grades back from your spoken word performances today, and I am going to need until Friday to get your midterm grades back, but I will have those back to you by Friday. So by the time you turn in everything on Tuesday, you should have a full understanding of where you stand grade-wise in the class, although I'm not really worried about any of your grades at this point in time. Again, thanks so much for all of your hard work. Really looking forward to wrapping things up with y'all and seeing what you turn up for your final performances. So, all of that being said then, today's lecture is going to cover Boal's Theater of the Oppressed piece that we read, the Derland piece on Greenpeace, and the piece on the border protests. So I don't want this to be a 2-hour lecture today. My plan here is to go through these in relatively broad strokes to get at what is most important for our purposes, but I do think that these two pieces are really important for thinking about your final projects because they give us some excellent examples of how to think about both participatory performances and site-specific or activist performances, which are some of the things that you're going to be thinking about engaging with when you're working on your final projects and your final exams. So we're going to start off by talking about participatory performances primarily, which is the Boal piece, and then we'll move from there to talk about the piece on Greenpeace and the border protests, because those are both examples of activist theater and also heavily incorporate the use of symbols. So we'll talk about them in that order, and I'm hoping that this lecture will be around 45 minutes and that you will use the rest of our time today to begin working on your performances to sort of get things in order so that when we talk, you have a pretty good idea of where you're going, and I can be as helpful as possible in guiding you. So we're just going to pause here real quick, and then we're going to get started on content. All right. So we're going to get started then by talking about the Poetics of the Oppressed, the chapter you read from Boal's book, The Theater of the Oppressed, that's based on field work that the author did in both Peru and Brazil, working particularly with oppressed or marginalized or impoverished communities and trying to empower them using theater as a device. So what we want to talk about in reference to Boal then is how participatory theater is understood as something that is politically engaged or something that can help underserved or oppressed groups participate in shaping their own political thought and their own political futures. And Powell is arguing in this piece that what theater can do is give agency to groups that are otherwise oppressed or do not have agency. So in this particular case, he's talking about the impoverished working classes in Peru and also in Brazil in some examples. So he's talking about people who are discriminated against because they are impoverished. And we should understand this piece as an attempt to write about the ways in which we can understand theater and performance as being a critical tool for these populations to conceive of and participate in their own advancement or resistance to their oppression or repression. So that's the basic way in which you want to understand this piece by Boal. And as I said, you really want to be reading this piece, I think, for how it might influence your own performances, because we're asking you, or I'm asking you in your final performances, especially if you choose the individual option, to incorporate a moment of participation, of audience participation into your performances. So this should give examples, some productive examples, I hope, of what that could mean or what that does mean. So to start off then, I think that it's important for us to sort of contextualize why this is important. So Boal begins by telling us the sort of origin story of the theater, where he talks about how in Greece, when the theater originated, it was originally the people's activity. It was a group of people singing in unison out in the fields, but eventually it was appropriated and rigidly defined by those in power. So he starts off then by conceiving of theater and performance as something that belongs to the people originally, that belongs to the collective originally, and is then taken and turned into this elite art, and in this way is made inaccessible to the collective. And his intention then is to put theater again at the service of the oppressed, to understand theater as a language that is capable of being used by any person with or without artistic talent, and that he conceives of theater as a way to give new concepts or ways of thinking about the world to oppressed persons in order to aid them in their own projects toward liberation. So there's something really important, I think, here, and you want to compare this, I think, productively to Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I think there are a lot of overlaps here in terms of themes that they're talking about. But the idea is not that you participate in this sort of colonialist or imperialist or paternalist project where you go to an oppressed culture and you're like, this is how you do things. Instead, the idea is to introduce theater as a way for these oppressed or repressed populations to conceive of their own political identities, to understand political problems in their communities, and then to act on them. I think that there are some places in this text where Boal is clearly influenced by Marx and clearly thinks that many of the problems that people face in society are based on capitalism and the division of labor and authority that happens underneath capitalistic societies. And so he does think that you have to treat teach people how to critique ideology, essentially, teach people how to be critical about the media they consume, about the social roles that they play, etc. So there is some part of Boal, I think, that thinks that like you do have to sort of train people to be Marxists, but the overall project is not to say this is how we train you to be a Marxist. It's to say this is how we train you to critically think about both the world in which you live in, and then to critically intervene in that world and try to shape it into your own making. So there's something very democratic in spirit about this, I think, where he really foremost wants to emphasize the agency or the participation of the audience or of the community in making theater. So his main goal then, and the way that he talks about this, is to turn spectators into subjects. To turn spectators into subjects. So we've been talking about all semester how performance studies is really invested in this idea of troubling the subject-object distinction. That is the idea that there are agents who are subjects that act on a world of objects that are inert and unfeeling. And so we've talked about how, for instance, men are configured as subjects and women are configured as objects, or how white people are configured as subjects and people who are not white are often configured as objects, or how civilization is considered a subject, but technology and nature are considered objects. And we've talked about ways in which we're really invested, or performance studies is really invested in giving more autonomy or agency to those to the object side of that division. And this is definitely something that Freire talked about too, in relationship to professors or educators being subjects and the students being objects. So in Boal's case, what he wants to say is that in theater historically, performers are subjects. That is, those who are actually performing on stage, are putting together the play, are members of the play theater ensemble, of the play group, the theater ensemble, that the people who actually participate in the performance are subjects, whereas the audience is just spectators. They are passive in relationship to what is presented. So whatever you see performed on a play, but you could easily apply this to media, or like to television or movies too, you just are taught to passively receive. You can't do anything about it. It's just the play. That's Shakespeare. You're not Shakespeare. You didn't write the play. So you're passive, and they're active performers of this script. And there are ways even in which you can conceive of, I think, the performers themselves as sort of not being subjects because they can't change what is written by the script. So in many ways, everything is subservient to the writing and directing of the show. Those are the real subjects, and everybody else is an object in relationship to that. So he talks about this historically in terms of Aristotle. And Aristotle says that the spectator, so Aristotle, first of all, is an ancient Greek philosopher. He is Plato's follower, slash inherits the mantle of Grecian philosophy or Greek philosophy from Plato. But he is one of the first people to write a book called Poetics, which is a sophisticated diagnosis of everything that goes into literary production, poems, and theater. That Aristotle is one of the first people to really rigorously analyze theatrical art as art. And in his analysis, he says that the spectator, so the person who is watching the drama, delegates their power to the dramatic character to think and act for them. Delegates their power to the dramatic character to think and act for them. So you identify with the protagonist in a play. You identify with the protagonist in the movie, and you delegate your power to that protagonist, and they act in this way for you. And so in ancient Greek theater, this is connected to what we would call catharsis. So catharsis is this idea that when you are watching a play, especially a tragedy, you will feel this overwhelming sort of surge of emotion that is in some ways cleansing. So we talk about moments as being cathartic, like we talk about a good cry as being cathartic, because it's something that is emotional, but we come out the other side feeling as if we have spent that emotion, and then we can pick ourselves up and feel better. So when we watch sad movies on purpose, it's oftentimes to generate this feeling of catharsis. And that is the ancient Greek way of thinking about the role of theater. So in many times, like Plato was critical of theater, so Aristotle's predecessor was critical of theater because he thought it whipped people up into a frenzy of emotion and made them unpredictable and potentially violent and ungovernable. Aristotle likes catharsis and wants to flip it on his head because he says that people need, the masses need, this means of emotional expression, so it's better that the play does it than they do it, so we should embrace this idea of catharsis, that people identify with people in the theater and then have their emotions sort of acted out by the actors. But so that is the Aristotle's paradigm, is of catharsis. And Boal wants to shift this to an idea of critical consciousness. So he talks about the next example in the history of theater he talks about is Brecht, who embodies this idea of critical catharsis a little bit better. And so in Brecht, as opposed to Aristotle, and Brecht is a German theater director. We talked about him as being famous for instances that break the fourth wall, that is the separation between the play and the audience. So in Brecht, the spectator delegates their power to the character in the same way as in Aristotle, but also reserves the right to think of oneself in opposition to the character. So the character recognizes, by breaking the fourth wall, that the audience is different from it, or illustrates that the audience is different from it. So it encourages the audience to engage in these moments of critical reflection about what is going on in the play in a way in which, in traditional theater, in Aristotle's conception of theater, there wouldn't be that breaking of the fourth wall. You wouldn't be encouraged to critically reflect on what you're watching. Instead, you would just totally identify. Brecht gives us the opportunity to be critical, but at the same time, we're still delegating the ultimate power to the character, Boal argues, that at the end of the day, it is what the characters do that define the play. So, in contrast, then, to both of these definitions or conceptions of the spectator, as someone who is relatively passive, at least, in comparison to the actors or the creators of the drama, Boal wants to give us this idea of the poetics of the oppressed or the theater of the oppressed, which is a moment in which the spectator assumes the role of the protagonist. They assume the role of the protagonist. That is, you are no longer, if you are a member of the audience just watching, you actually become a part of the theatrical performance and help in that way produce the final result of what the theater piece is and does. And Boal wants to talk about this much in the way you might think about Frere's problem posing education as training for real action. Boal wants to conceive of this as a way in which, by engaging in theatrical play, individuals in these oppressed communities can be trained to think about critically and engage in and participate in civic activities or political activities that are central to their communities. So in this way, they can be politically empowered. So we views this transition from the spectator to the subject then as the cultivation of critical consciousness, but also as training for real action. So going beyond Brecht and saying, this is a way in which we can actually educate people on how to solve real world problems. So he's going to talk about this then, first of all, in terms of the transfer of the means of production. So that is a Marxist idea. But so for Marx, the means of production is what you need in order to produce capital or to produce a product. So the means of production, for instance, for a paper mill would be the trees. You would have to own the land for the trees. Then you would have to own the mill. And in that circumstance, you would have the machinery and the resources, the means of production, the way in which you could produce something. So he wants to think about this here in terms of the spectator seizing the means of production for theater. That is, the spectator taking the production of theater into their own hands. And it is Marxist in that conceit, he's going to say. He then stages a comparison between what he is conceiving of in terms of the theater of the oppressed and photography. So he talks about how in Peru he gave cameras and taught the local villagers to use cameras and had them document their own lived realities. So take pictures of things, for instance, that are symbols of exploitation. And then he had them come together and compare the photographs that they took in order to cultivate some sort of community meaning. And he's saying here that photographs or teaching photography gives the oppressed populations in Peru that he was working with the ability to express themselves and to capture their own knowledge or perspectives in a way that can be communicated or shared perhaps more easily. And he wants to say that we should compare this to what theater should do. That body, the body, like the performer's body, is to the theater what the camera is for photography. So if we think about the just teaching people how to use a camera is the way we teach them how to express themselves through photography. In this circumstance, teaching people how to act through their body is what we need to do in order to teach them to realize their own political capacity as theatrical performers, or their own ability to perform theatrically in this way that can make an important social or political difference. So he goes through then, in the remainder of the article, 5 different stages of freedom from being a spectator. 5 different stages of freedom from being a spectator. In each one of these stages, he gives a number of different activities that a person can do, theatrical activities, in order to, as examples of using theater to work through these stages of freeing oneself from being a spectator and making oneself a subject. So the first stage, for instance, is knowing the body. So as we just talked about then, he says that we have to understand the body in order to understand what theater we can do and in order to understand how we can express ourselves through theater. That the body is the language of theater. And he says that while literal spoken language is alien from us, that is something that is passed down to us, our bodies are not. That we live inside of our bodies, and so we need to, first of all, come to understand them. But in this discussion, he says that the difficulty of that, the problem with coming to know the body, is that in everyday labor, in work, we are just taught how to use our bodies in order to be productive, So we cater our bodies to farm or work on the factory line. So he talks about this then as muscular alienation, the idea that our bodies are routinized, so put in routines, or conditioned to do certain actions, but we're not conditioned to use our body as a mode of expression. So he says that in order to think about how we can use our bodies in a mode that is promising for thinking about social action or political action, we have to raise how we use our bodies to the level of consciousness and understand that they're usually governed by work. And what he means by raise it to the level of consciousness is just we need to be conscious of the ways in which our bodies function and the ways in which they are constrained by our normal environments or our working environments. So, for instance, just like as a personal anecdote, I guess that relates to this. I am a graduate student, so I spend a whole lot of time sitting in front of my laptop and writing. But in that process, I am not in contact with a lot of my body, that my back especially and my shoulders, I hunch, they begin to hurt. So only really recently, after being in school for like 10 or 15 years, have I made sure that I am working in one chair for a while, and then every 45 minutes I stand up and I walk around a little bit, and then maybe I move to a different position where my back's supported differently. But we aren't really taught to do that. And if you're working in the factory, you certainly don't have the privilege to be like, oh, I'm going to go over here now. If you're working in a factory, you are standing in one place the whole time. So the idea here then is that the theater and theater games can teach people how to re-access their body. So he gives a couple of different examples here. So for instance, the slow motion race being when people race across the room, but the goal is, while continuously moving, to get there the slowest. And this teaches you to notice your body and try to get your body to do something in a way that is counterintuitive, because we're used to trying to speed up our bodies, not slow them down. In another example, he talks about shadow boxing, how two people interacting through boxing without touching will teach them how to be responsive to one another in an embodied form, without actually making embodied contact. And that sort of playful use of the body, that play, is something that is incredibly rare for adults who don't have a lot of access to that unless they are literally athletes most of the time. So those are two examples he gives then about ways in which theater games can help us get back in touch with our bodies. And this brings us to his second main point, which is, or the second stage of being free from being a spectator, which is making your body expressive. That is, developing a vocabulary for body expression, thinking about what your movements, what your posture, what your facial expressions communicate, and developing a sensitivity toward the body as an expressive form in a way that we are usually not taught to think about the body. So here we should think for both of these first and second stages, then I think this connects really naturally to, for instance, Porter's discussion of body intellectuals, the idea that in Western culture we are really alienated from our own bodies in most circumstances. That is, we feel detached from them, or as if we are brains first or language first, and thinking then about how our bodies are expressive outside of language, how our bodies are expressive in unique ways, is really important to freeing ourselves, and to cultivating what he's talking about as being this subjectivity as audience members. So the third step that he talks about in this work toward freedom, or this work toward subjectivity, is treating what he calls theater as language. Theater as language. And here we're given three of, I think, our most sort of promising, or the most interesting forms of participatory theater that are talked about in this piece. So this is really going to be our focus. So in terms of theater as language, what he's trying to say is, or what he's trying to talk about, is using theater as a way to encourage people to participate in the construction of what happens in the play, the scene, or the skit. So he gives three examples. So the first one is what he calls simultaneous dramaturgy. Simultaneous dramaturgy. So this is one example of a participatory performance in which what happens is you play out a scene, and all of these scenes are things that will be politically, socially, or culturally relevant to a community's issues. So in this first example then, you would play out a scene, that is, in simultaneous dramaturgy, you would play out a scene until its moment of climax, or until the moment in which there is a problem that needs resolution. And then you call on the audience and ask them to intervene in what just happened. in order to resolve or create the ending to the drama. So, in that way, how the play resolves, how the drama or performance resolves, is dictated by the audience, not by the actors, and not by the playwright. So, the subjectivity then over the final part is given to the audience. In image theater, which is more of a participatory game in some ways, it works sort of similarly, but we're given the idea of an actual ideal and a transitional image. So, what that means is that they will create a scene that is a frozen scene. So, you're going to arrange your bodies as a group in order to act out a scene as it actually happened or depict a scene as it actually happened in the world. And then they'll perform an ideal scene. That is, how would this have looked better? And then the audience is responsible for figuring out how to transition the bodies of the actor from the actual into the ideal. From the actual into the ideal. So, for instance, when I taught this class before, it was right after, or one of the times I taught this class before, it was right after that poor passenger got dragged off the Delta Airlines flight. So, in an image theater recreation of that, we had the scene of the person being dragged off the flight. We had an ideal scene of that of the people, the people who were on the sidelines or the other members of the flight standing up to intervene against that happening, and putting the person back in the plane, and then the transitional image of how you would get from what actually happened to that ideal moment. So, in this way, then, in a distilled series of images, we're saying, here's the world as it is, here's the world how it ought to be, and you're giving the audience the participatory agency to try to figure out how to get us from point A to point B. Forum theater is very similar in this way, because forum theater is when people gather, and a scene is chosen that represents a cultural, political, or social issue that is plaguing the local community or in some way affecting the local community. So the example that Boal gives is of an oppressive boss who's making their workers work 12-hour shifts. So the idea is in forum theater that you perform the scene as it actually was. You perform the ideal scene. I'm sorry, not the ideal scene, the actual scene. You perform things as it actually took place, in a way that reflects the problems that you're trying to solve, that acts out the problems that you are trying to resolve in the community. And then you do it again. But what happens is that the members of the audience have the right to freeze and then replace any actor and intervene in, therefore, what happens in the play in order to propose a solution to the problem. And then you see in an experimental way how that would go over based on the reactions of the audience and the actors. And then you can do it again so that more community members have the opportunity to voice their opinions. And so that's the idea behind forum theater. And you'll see in each of these instances what is happening is the spectator is becoming a subject. The audience member has the authority to participate in the performance, which is rarely granted to them. And in participating in the performance, agency is extended to them. That is, they have power over what happens, and they're given the opportunity to think critically about and to think about how they would respond to real world issues. So the fourth category that he gives us for thinking about um, this is theater as a discourse. So theater and language and theater as discourse, they're very close. We don't have to really separate those out because, again, the main point is that we're trying to think about how performance can be critically mobilized and mobilized in a way that makes the audience more active. So the fourth section, I think, should be better understood, or the difference maybe between the third and fourth section, we might say, is between exercise in which the audience is participating, as we've said, and then exercises that are meant to cultivate a critical mindset in the audience. Exercises that are meant to cultivate a critical mindset in the audience or teach the audience how to think in ways that are sensitive to their own oppression or repression, in ways that teach them how to critically identify how power structures are supported or justified in their everyday culture, in their everyday rituals, and in their everyday media. So, for instance, the first example he gives is newspaper theater, which is when people will perform sections of the news out loud and oftentimes contrast headlines against one another in order to get a critical sense of what is going on in the world and how different events contrast with one another or produce different meanings when you perform them side by side. So to read the news critically through performance. The second example he gives is invisible theater, which is the idea of live performances for unsuspecting audiences that are about social or political issues. And we'll talk about this more in the next two pieces because I think that this maps really closely to what we would call guerrilla theater. That is, it is not authorized theater. It is you are doing a theatrical performance in a public place in order to get the audience, who does not know typically that a theater event is happening, to think critically about something. So the example he gives here is that a performance that was staged at a restaurant in which a discourse happened loudly between a patron who could not afford to eat at the restaurant and a waiter for the restaurant in a way that made the rest of the patrons at the restaurant think critically about class and its relationship to who gets to eat at this fancy establishment. Or that's sort of my read of what he describes there anyway. But the idea of invisible theater in this way is you don't know it's theater, which might distinguish it in some ways from some instances of guerrilla theater at least. At the restaurant, you think that those performers are real people. And so by bringing the conflict to the surface, by making something happen that seems real, you can promote a critical consciousness in the audience. So I just want to talk about two more examples here. The first one is his discussion of acting out the photo romance. So what he's talking about here is like telenovelas or soap operas, right? And he's saying that people don't really have oftentimes a critical recognition of what is being depicted or justified in this very popular form of media because they view it passively. But if you have the participants or the people who you are working with enact the soap operas before they actually watch them. So you're given the prompt or the script for the soap opera or the setup for the soap opera. So you're given the setup for the soap opera, and then the participants enact what they think would happen based on that setup, and then they watch the soap opera, and then comparing what their perceptions of what would happen given what was described with what was actually depicted, they start to realize or be able to critically see the differences between the values that are expressed in the telenovela and their own values. So in that way, then they can also cultivate a critical consciousness. And this is very much the same sort of thing he says can happen in myth theater, analytic theater, and masks and rituals, where by performing a cultural myth, by performing the different social roles that are involved in a particular scene, or by performing a cultural ritual from various different points of view, you get to see the power dynamics that operate underneath all of these things, and it creates this sort of critical consciousness. Then the last example that I want to talk about is breaking repression, which is similar to these other examples in that it's about building this form of critical consciousness, but I also think is similar to participatory theater examples in that it calls upon the participant or the audience to intervene in the action in the way that we've been discussing. So the idea behind breaking repression is that you have a person identify and act out a moment in their life in which they felt truly repressed. That is, they felt as if they could not act in the way they wanted to act. They could not believe what they wanted to believe. Were not free, etc. So acting out a moment in which somebody felt truly and authentically repressed, and then reenacting that moment, but in the moment in which the protagonist or the person who's acting out had folded or given over to that moment of repression in real life, they enact the resistance to that oppression that they wish they had enacted, or that they think it would have been strategic for them to have enacted. And in that way, they are once again empowered or given agency. So that is the general point of the idea of the theater or the poetics of the oppressed, and the idea of participatory performance interventions as a whole, is that you are trying to teach people how to have agency over their own political lives. And you do that by making them active participants in constructing what happens in a theatrical performance, or by making them critical recipients of what they think about, or I mean, of what they digest or consume when they watch media or theater in their own lives. And by, in that way, teaching them to be both critical and agents or subjects, Boal says theater has the capacity to really teach people to think critically about their own situations and actually believe that they can change them, and actually believe that they can change them. So that's where we're going to wrap up our discussion of Boal. I just wanted to briefly conclude this by saying that, so when you're thinking about your own performances, then lots of these might not be things that you can enact in a direct way on Facebook, for instance, or if you're doing your performance individually, but creating a moment in which you want to say, hey, audience, participate. But there are real ways in which you can structure in moments of engagement like this. So maybe your performance builds to a climax, and you say, now we're going to open it up to audience participation, and you perform how you would resolve it, but you also specify that the audience may have chosen to resolve it in different ways. So thinking about forum theater, I think especially, but also simultaneous dramaturgy, or the theater, or the exercise of resisting repression, all of these things as ways in which to think about structuring your performance in a way that is both participatory, or that is participatory, and tries to use participation to create a political effect or reach a political end. That's how you want to think about participatory performance when you're mobilizing that, if you do mobilize that in your own performance. So this discussion ended up being a little bit longer than I intended, as usual. The next video will be briefer, but I am going to cut this video here and upload it, and I'll upload another lecture in just a moment. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you in 1 second.